Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for your patience and for your presence here tonight. We apologize. I know that we wanted to start promptly at 7:30, but as I know that you were probably very much aware, traffic was horrible to get here this evening. So we really thank you for the effort that you've made to come out here this evening. It isn't often that here at Belen we make meetings mandatory, but this particular one and this topic is one that we feel needs to be addressed. And every year we gather the parents of 8th grade students and the new parents of 9th grade students to gather so that we can be well-informed parents and well-informed educators. It is very unfortunate that our students and our young men today are in the predicament of a society in which alcohol and drugs are in their presence, and we need to know what really are the trends, what is happening, so that we can educate them and we can help them in this journey. This evening, we have our guest speaker, and then later on, after our guest speaker, Mr. Tohami de Quesada, who is our Dean of Men, will speak briefly about the policy of alcohol and drug here at Belen. Our guest speaker this evening is a friend to our school. I had the pleasure of meeting him a couple of years ago when he came to do an in-service for the faculty. Mr. Raymond Estefania is the Director of Family Recovery Specialist of Miami, an adult and adolescent addiction treatment program. He is a psychotherapist, a certified addiction and intervention professional. He has been working in the field of substance abuse prevention and treatment for over 20 years and was formerly the Adolescent Program Director of South Miami Hospital's Addiction Treatment Program. He has worked extensively with adolescents, adults, the family members who have been affected by the disease of alcohol and drug addiction. He also has organized and implemented numerous substance abuse prevention programs in both public and private schools. His presentation this evening will offer tremendous insight and help us in our journey as parents and as educators. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mr. Estefania. Thank you.
Hi everyone, good evening. Thanks for being here. It's a really important topic and one that I'm very passionate about and one that I've dedicated over 20 years of my career to. We've got about an hour tonight. I know there may be some families that are running late because of traffic. I do have a PowerPoint, however, I tend to just talk, so sometimes what I'm talking about may not necessarily correspond to what's up on the screen, but we're going to talk and try to hit on all the points. I am an addiction specialist. I've been treating adolescents in prevention and treatment, as you heard, for over 20 years, and it's a challenging time of life. You all are parents of 8th graders, is that right? Maybe some 9th graders as well? Okay, so in my experience, that is about the age where kids start to experiment with alcohol and drugs. There's something that happens in that transition from elementary, 6th, 7th grade into 7th, 8th. And a lot of the kids that I see start experimenting with alcohol and other substances around the age of anywhere between 13 and 15. So this is a crucial age. This is a very important age. Anytime there is a transition, right? This transition from middle to high school is extremely important as it relates to this topic. The other transition that's really important is the one from high school to college. So we're going to talk tonight a little bit about trends. We're going to talk about why it's so important to keep our children drug-free. We're going to talk about some of the signs and symptoms. And then most importantly, we're going to talk about what you can do as a parent to encourage your children to make better decisions. I heard a statistic recently. I'll say this. I deal with a lot of young adults that unfortunately are addicted to substances. The important thing about what I'm about to tell you is they started as teenagers. We know that addiction is a developmental disease. What that means is most adults that are addicted to substances, and it could be any substance, started experimenting and using those substances when they were teenagers. In the last 3 weeks, I've had 2 young adults that I worked with personally die from heroin overdose. You've heard about heroin in this country right now. We have an epidemic right now of young people that are dying from overdose. These 2 young men were young men that I worked with when they were teenagers, and they weren't using heroin. They were smoking marijuana and drinking and maybe experimenting with a couple other things that we'll talk about tonight, but they had not made that jump from, you know, what people perceive as kind of less harmful drugs to something like heroin, which is more harmful. The reason I tell you this is because those kids started out somewhere where they thought it wasn't a big deal, where they thought that they were going to be able to manage it. Obviously, something happened along the way where they were not able to. I heard a statistic recently that really shocked me. For as long as I can remember, the number one way that you typically hear about young people dying is what? Car accidents. That's the way they, you know, seem to die more than any other cause. We have just made a shift in this country. More young people are dying from overdose today than from car accidents. That's a horrifying statistic to me. It should be cause for alarm for all of us in here and certainly all of us across the country. And that's why we're here tonight, because we can prevent those deaths. We can help our kids make better decisions, and you are probably the most important reason that your kids will make better decisions. What we know is parents are the number one influence, and parents can encourage their kids to make good decisions around this issue. Let's talk about some trends. The other thing we're hearing a lot about, and I know you are as well, is marijuana, right? It's in the news. It's being legalized in a lot of different places. It is not the drug that was around 25 years ago. It is a more potent drug. It is a more addictive drug. And so we're going to talk a lot about that tonight. So let's talk about why it's so important. Brain development is really what we're going to talk about. We know, our kids at 8th and 9th grade are 14, 15 years old. We know that the brain does not fully develop until probably 24, 25. That's what the latest research is telling us. We used to think it was about 21, and that's the reason for the drinking age being what it is. The insurance companies have known this for many years, because if you think about it, your insurance rates start to go down when you hit about your mid-20s. I don't know about you, but I know a lot of 20-somethings that still have a long way to go to mature. It seems like our kids are maturing later and later today than they did 25 years ago. I'm not sure what that's about. I have a theory. I think a lot of it is parenting, but I think there's other factors as well. So what we know is that the younger a child starts experimenting, the more likely they are to develop a problem. We know this. We know that the vulnerable 14, 15, 16-year-old brain will become addicted to a substance very quickly. What can take an adult years to develop a problem with can happen to an adolescent in a matter of months. It can happen that quickly. NIH, the National Institutes of Health, did a study some years ago, and what they found was if young people waited until they were 21 years old to drink alcohol, their risk of ever developing a problem went down by like 70%. So what does this mean for you? A lot of us probably are thinking, well, it's unrealistic to think that my son or my daughter is going to wait until he or she is 21 years old. And that may be true, I got to tell you, I have a 23-year-old daughter at home, and I know for a fact she didn't wait till she was 21 to experiment with alcohol. But I'll tell you what she did do. We made it very difficult for her. We did not make it easy. So what we essentially did is we postponed it as long as we could. And I'm here to tell you, if we can postpone it at least until college age, when they go to college, their risk still goes significantly down. It's the kids that are experimenting at 14, 15, and 16 years old that are going to get in big trouble. And so we have to be aware of that. You know, that part of the brain for teenagers, that executive part of the brain, that part of the brain that weighs consequences and delays gratification and is able to manage, you know, the emotions, and all that part of the brain develops last. You know which part of the brain develops first? The part of the brain that's impulsive, the part of the brain that seeks pleasure, the part of the brain that wants to feel good. That part of the brain in an adolescent develops first. And so you are that executive part of the brain for your children. You are the ones that set the limits and help them, encourage them to make better decisions. And so what I'm saying is, it's not about teaching these kids how to drink responsibly. We have to understand it from a scientific standpoint and know that the teenage brain can't drink responsibly. Very few kids can have a truly social, casual relationship with alcohol. Most of them get in trouble, and we're going to talk more about that tonight. So these are just some different slides that really address the brain, the different parts of the brain. So that frontal cortex, that's the part that develops later. The amygdala is the part of the brain that develops early for adolescents. You can't see this slide terribly well, unfortunately, but it's really, it's a depiction of the different pathways in the brain where drugs and alcohol work. Drugs and alcohol, when someone becomes addicted, they're not necessarily addicted to the substance they're using, they're addicted to what that substance does to the brain. The dopamine system, the serotonin system, these are just the systems that are activated, if you will, when someone introduces alcohol or marijuana or cocaine into their body. Anytime you do something that's pleasurable, think of anything that you do that's pleasurable. Some people, it's exercise. For me, it's I like to have my little piece of chocolate when I get home. Whatever it is, think of something you do that feels good and multiply that times 1,000. And that's what cocaine feels like. And that's what marijuana feels like. And that's what, alcohol feels like to the teenage brain. And what we know, and you already know this about your kids, because what do kids want to do when they do something that's fun? They don't want to stop doing it. They want to continue to experience that pleasure. So imagine a 15, 16-year-old being introduced to marijuana or alcohol or cocaine and feeling that euphoria that comes along with that. What do you think they're going to want to do? They're going to want to experience that over and over, and that's how addiction starts, and that's when they get into trouble. This is a slide, again, showing where addiction typically starts. And if you see, most addiction, most people that start to develop substance abuse and addiction start experimenting in their teenage years. I may see a gentleman or a lady at 40 or 50 years old who's got an addiction problem, but 9 times out of 10, when I ask them, when did you start with using these substances? More often than not, they will tell me I was a teenager. I was in high school, or I was about to transition to college. And so again, if we can delay that and encourage these kids to wait, their chances are much less that they'll ever have a problem. Another slide sort of just showing us the same thing, really. Let's talk about alcohol, folks, because it is the most important one, I think, for us. Because even kids that won't experiment with marijuana and some other drugs, they will experiment with alcohol. It is the #1 abused and used substance among teenagers. It's socially acceptable. It's easy for them to obtain usually, and it's what they will typically experiment with first. Alcohol is not something, you all may have a glass of wine with dinner or a beer on Sunday watching the game. Teenagers typically don't have that sort of casual relationship with alcohol. They drink for the effect. They drink for how it makes them feel. They typically binge drink, which means they drink a large amount in a short amount of time. They play drinking games, right? They drink a lot, and sometimes they drink more than they can handle. We know that alcohol is a central nervous system depressant, which means it slows down heart rate, it slows down respiration, and if you drink enough, it can slow things down to the point where you can die. I often get calls from hospitals in the area on the weekends where some teenager has gone to a party and had so much to drink that he or she ends up overdosing as a result of it. Now, a lot of parents fall into the trap, unfortunately, of thinking, you know, I want to teach my 15 or 16-year-old. I want him or her to learn how to drink responsibly. Has anybody ever heard this? I hear it a lot. I'm here to tell you that doesn't work. And the science clearly shows it. The science clearly shows us that teenagers are not able to drink socially responsibly. And we're going to talk about what some of the consequences are. We know the earlier they begin drinking, the more likely they are to have a problem. We know that they often mix alcohol with other drugs. I will get calls from again, hospitals or parents where a child has been drinking, has mixed that with maybe a Xanax pill or a Valium pill or something like that, often something they got at home or from a friend's house, and that's a devastating combination. All of a sudden now 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4, now 2 + 2 equals 6 or 8 or 10 because they enhance one another. We know that if addiction runs in the family, that could also increase the likelihood of a child ending up with a problem. So if alcoholism or addiction runs in the family, you want to be careful and you want to talk to your kids about that because it could make them more at risk. So alcohol leads to things like impaired judgment, which leads to injuries, death, car crashes, drownings, sexually transmitted disease, unwanted pregnancy, even rape. I heard another statistic the other day that was pretty alarming. 1 in 5 college-age girls has been date raped, has been the victim of a rape of some kind, and I will tell you that in most of those cases, alcohol is involved. Another scary statistic, right? So it's just important for us to know what alcohol does. I met some years ago with the mother of a 15-year-old girl. She had brought her to my office because she was concerned about her drinking. They sat down in my office and the mother said to me, she's been hospitalized 3 times in the last year and a half because of alcohol. Not once, not twice, but 3 times had to go to the hospital. And so I asked the question. I remember thinking, wow, like, how does this 15-year-old get this alcohol? And I said, Mom, where does she drink? And she says, well, she goes to parties and she drinks. And I remember thinking to myself, it took me a second or two to think about how to ask the question, but it was sort of an obvious one for me. And I said to her, well, Mom, maybe she shouldn't go to these parties, right? Seemed like a logical question or statement to make, right? And I remember, I'll never forget it to this day, the mother looking at me with this confused look in her eye and saying, well, what's she gonna do? That's her social life. And I remember thinking, where have we come to as a society when a mother of a 15-year-old thinks that this is a normal social life for her daughter? And folks, I run into this a lot. Parents who have just sort of accepted that this is what kids do and there's nothing they can do about it, and every kid is doing it, and they just kind of fall into that trap. And I'm here to tell you it's a slippery slope, and it's a dangerous trap to fall into for our kids. One other thing that alcohol does that a lot of people don't realize is it slows down the maturation process. So that developing brain that's learning crucial skills at 14, 15, 16, 17 years old, learning how to regulate its emotions, manage stress, deal with feelings, right? Curb its impulses, is learning these life skills. What happens when a child starts drinking? That becomes their coping mechanism. Now when they're happy, they drink. When they're sad, they drink. When they're stressed, they drink. They learn to deal with their emotions and to deal with stress by using drugs or drinking. which takes away their ability to learn those healthier coping skills, and it stops their growth, their emotional growth. I meet with 20-some-year-old students a lot who end up in my office for a variety of different reasons, and they're often drinking and smoking marijuana. And they might be 24, 25 years old. And it's funny because as I'm talking to them, some of them have been drinking and smoking since they're 14 or 15, 16. Now they're 24, 25, and what I realize as I'm talking to them is that I'm talking to a 24-year-old body. They look like a 24-year-old, but emotionally, maturity-wise, I'm talking to a 15-year-old. Because that person's emotional growth stopped as they started using and developing that dependency on the substances. It's pretty scary. I always talk to the kids when I speak about alcohol poisoning because, kids more and more, the ones I talk to, especially high school age, are being exposed to going to parties and are finding themselves in a situation where someone has had too much to drink. And they often don't know what to do. And one thing they will do a lot of times is they will take a kid who's had too much to drink and is maybe passed out, and they will go lay them in a room somewhere in the house where nobody is, and they'll just let them sleep it off. Folks, I've heard over the years many situations where those kids have come back to that room later on to find that child has died. Right? Has either overdosed, has asphyxiated themselves, maybe choked on their own vomit. There's lots of different ways it can happen. So I always talk about signs of alcohol poisoning. I know parents that have been in that same situation, and what I always say to the kids, if you're not sure, go get an adult, call 911, make sure somebody assesses that person. And I always tell parents, don't assume that putting them to bed and letting them sleep it off is necessarily the best way to handle it. If you're not sure, it's always best to either go to an emergency room or call your pediatrician, get some professional help. It's just not worth the risk. So binge drinking, we talked about this. Kids drink a lot in a short amount of time. We know that alcohol is alcohol. It doesn't matter what form it comes in. A beer has the same amount of alcohol as a shot of whiskey does and a glass of wine. It's the same amount of alcohol. The kids will tell me, well, I was just drinking beer. So what? The only difference is a few more trips to the bathroom. That's the only difference between a beer and, a shot of alcohol. But they don't understand that sometimes. And so they'll drink a lot in a short amount of time, and they often won't know where their threshold is, where their tolerance level is, and this is where they get in trouble, because they don't have the experience. And they're kind of trying it out, and sometimes they end up in trouble. So this is a brain scan of a 15-year-old non-drinker and a 15-year-old heavy drinker. Now, the lighted areas that you see on the left, those areas of the brain that you see in pink and red, that's kind of the way a brain should look. That means that brain is doing what it's supposed to. That's brain activity on that left-hand slide. On the right, what do you see? You don't see as much activity, do you? This child was drinking almost on a daily basis. And so what you see is the brain has shut down in a number of those areas, many of the crucial areas. And so now while that child would probably be fine if he or she stopped drinking, in this case, this young man, if he stopped drinking, he probably would recover. But at some point, when you drink enough over an extended period of time, you can do permanent damage to the brain and to other organs in the body. We know about the liver and the kidneys and things like that, but we don't always think of what it does to the brain. So again, it's just showing you the effect of alcohol on the brain. I just put this in there so we all remember that, children do die from drinking. They do die from alcohol and drugs. I see it. About twice a year or so, in this case, it's already been twice in the last month, I have to go to a funeral. of some child who has died. It's usually because of a car accident or an overdose, and usually the car accident involved alcohol and drugs. So we need to remember this, because our kids will tell us, oh, it's no big deal, everybody's doing it. What's wrong if I go to parties and drink alcohol? And I want you to know that that's not what a 15, 16-year-old should be doing. It's normal for them to experiment. That's what they do at that age. But I think it's up to us as parents to make it as difficult as possible. Don't you agree? Let's talk about marijuana, because it's becoming more and more important, I think, from the standpoint of more and more states are legalizing it. It's not legal here in Florida yet, at least not fully, but I bet it will be very soon. There's roughly, I think, about 25 states. So many are, enacting different laws that I can't keep up with them all. But the perception among our young people as they continue to hear these states legalizing marijuana, what do you think the perception of harm? The perception of harm is going down. They don't think it's harmful. They tell me all the time, oh, marijuana's no big deal. It's legal. And unfortunately, folks, I find a lot of parents that are falling into the same trap and are thinking, it is legal. A lot of kids are doing it. I'll even have parents say, well, I did it when I was younger. What's the big deal? Folks, I'm here to tell you that the marijuana that's around today is not the marijuana from 20, 25 years ago. It's a different drug. It's more potent. It's more addictive. It's being grown in very sophisticated ways, where they've produced a marijuana today that is just almost not even the same drug as some of you may remember from 20 years ago or whatever it is. I know, I've been around a while. I've seen marijuana sort of develop over the years, and this is a new drug. And kids don't realize it. They don't realize it. Some of the consequences we're seeing a lot of kids with increased mental illness. We're seeing kids end up in the emergency room or the psychiatric hospital because of psychosis, because they've been smoking marijuana. It's affecting their brain. We see kids losing motivation, failing out of school, losing interest in sports and other hobbies and activities that they once enjoyed and were passionate about. I see marijuana take away a kid's drive and his passion. And listen, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that marijuana is the worst drug in the world. I'm not, but I am going to tell you that it's a lot worse than people think it is. And we're running into another slippery slope, if you ask me, because of this legalization. I had an 8-year-old not long ago. Mother came to me and told me about her 8-year-old that got a hold of the older brother. The older brother went to college in Colorado, and he came home for vacation and he brought some edibles to the house. Do you know what edibles are? It's marijuana that you eat. It's in a candy or a cookie, right? It's got high doses of THC. Well, the kid got the brother's edibles, thought they were cookies, ate the whole bag of cookies when you were supposed to eat 2. And the 8-year-old ended up in the hospital, was like hallucinating, was in a psychotic episode because he didn't know what he was eating. So this is the marijuana of today. There's this oil, too, that kids are using. You may have heard of it. They call it dabs. The equivalent would be, maybe back in our day, would be something called hash oil. Right? But there's this oil that kids are smoking. Used to be back in the 80s or so, 70s, we were talking 1 to 3% THC in your average marijuana. This oil can have 80 and 90% THC. It's almost like the crack form of marijuana. It's an incredibly potent drug, and kids are using it. And you know how they smoke it? And sometimes you won't even smell it, because they use those electronic cigarettes that I've actually had kids that, the parents let them smoke the e-cigarettes. And so the parent thinks he's smoking the nicotine oil, but he's really smoking the marijuana oil. And they don't even realize it. So it's scary stuff. Marijuana affects a lot of different parts of the brain. We've talked about some of them already, but cognition, memory, ability to solve, complex cognitive tasks, motivation, all of these areas are affected when kids smoke. Addiction. A lot of kids, and parents too, think you can't be addicted to marijuana. You absolutely can. I have kids that I treat that cannot go a day without smoking marijuana. I had a kid in my office the other day that smoked marijuana 4 to 5 times per day. He was high 24/7. Even when he wasn't smoking, he was still under the influence. How could that child possibly do well in school? How could that child possibly make good decisions in his life? It's just not, it doesn't work. They're not capable. Here's just a survey that was done by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Association that kind of looked at the difference in attitudes between kids who smoke and kids who don't. Look at some of the differences there between kids who smoke marijuana and kids who don't. It changes them. It changes the way they think. It changes their values. It changes what's important to them. It changes how they look at life. Now, a lot of people will tell you that marijuana does not lead to other drugs. I'm here to tell you that just because you smoke marijuana doesn't mean that someone is going to use other drugs, but I am going to tell you that the majority of people who do use harder and more dangerous drugs, what do you think they started with? Alcohol and marijuana. So our kids are not going to start. Those kids that I told you that died, they didn't start using heroin. They started using drugs that they thought they could handle, that weren't a big deal, that weren't dangerous or harmful in their minds, but clearly it led to other things that ultimately resulted in their death. I'm going to run through some of these. These are just some of the other drugs that we see. Ecstasy is one. Very popular. How many people have heard of Ultra? Ultra? If you haven't heard of it yet, give it time. You will hear of it. Because your child will bring it up to you, right? It's this big music festival that they have in downtown Miami that I stay far away from when it comes to town. My daughter, who went to Lourdes, by the way, and is 23 today, asked me every single year of her high school, could she go to Ultra? She's 23 today, and guess what? She's never been to Ultra. I didn't let her go while I had control, and once she was old enough to go, she'd ask me for the money, and I'd say no. Because I'm not going to facilitate it. I can't stop her from going, but I'm not going to make it easy, because I know what's happening at Ultra, right? Ultra is all about this. It's all about ecstasy and designer drugs and smoking marijuana. I mean, the ambulances are parked ready to go at Ultra because there's going to be overdoses and they know it. And this is what our kids want to go to. And this is what some parents are saying, here's $200, buy 2 tickets and go to Ultra, because they don't know any better. They don't know any better. There's a slide of an ecstasy, the effect of ecstasy on the brain. The slide on the left, that's a slide of a brain that's been using ecstasy. It looks like Swiss cheese. It's not Swiss cheese. Those aren't actually holes, but they look like holes. Those are areas of the brain that are inactive because of the effect of ecstasy on the brain. Ecstasy, if you can't really see this slide terribly well either, but this is basically, ecstasy affects the serotonin system primarily. Serotonin is one of the neurotransmitters in the brain. It's got many functions, but one of its functions is basically kind of your overall mood. So when you suffer from depression, you typically have low levels of serotonin. ecstasy actually depletes serotonin in the brain. So it's not uncommon to find kids that have been using ecstasy now suffering from clinical depression and needing to go on antidepressants to balance some of the neurotransmitters and alleviate the symptoms of depression. Prescription drugs, we're hearing about this too. A lot of the kids that we hear that are dying from heroin overdose actually started with these drugs, prescription medications that they got. Sometimes it was for pain, sometimes it was because they just found them in their, in their parents' medicine cabinet or something, but it typically starts out with this. Remember about 5-6 years ago, maybe longer, we heard about all the pain clinics in Florida, typically in Broward County, Palm Beach County. There was doctors that were basically providing opiate medications, narcotics to people. Well, that's gone now. The federal government, the DEA, they shut that down. But guess what guess what resulted from that? They had a whole lot of people out there that had become addicted to these pain medications and couldn't get them anymore, so what do you think they did? They started getting heroin on the street. It was cheaper, it was easier to get, and it would get them higher than the pills would. So that's where this heroin epidemic that we have now in all cities across America. Really bad up in the Northeast and in the Midwest, but it's here in Miami too. I see college kids at UM. Kids at UM that are shooting heroin. It's crazy. It's scary. Here's where they get it, primarily. You would think that they'd be getting their drug, from a drug dealer, but look where they're getting it. You know where they're usually getting it? At someone's house, at maybe your house or my house. Right? Because you go to the dentist and get a prescription, or you have some dental work done, you get a prescription for some pain medicine. If you're like me, you take it for a day, maybe, or two, and then it sits in the medicine cabinet. And then what happens? The kids get it. And then they start experimenting, and that leads to the addiction. So things like sedatives, painkillers, depressants, stimulants. There's another one, stimulants. How many kids do we know, maybe some of your kids, that have attention deficit, that maybe take a stimulant to treat a condition? Their friends will get a hold of those drugs. I hear college-age kids all the time that abuse stimulants to study. They'll stay up all night studying, taking their friend's Ritalin, and then they'll crash the next day. And then they'll develop a cycle where eventually they won't even be able to study without it. And what happens? They develop a dependency on stimulants. And now they can't perform without it. So we talked a little bit about depressants already, what they do to the body. Remember, depressants slow down the central nervous system. Slow down heart rate, slow down respiration. If you slow it down enough, it stops. Stimulants do the opposite. So cocaine, Ritalin, drugs like that, they speed up the central nervous system. You speed up heart rate and respiration. If you speed it up too much, what happens? It gets going so fast that it ultimately shuts down. So both ways that these drugs can really create a dangerous situation for someone who doesn't have the experience and really doesn't know what they're doing and isn't being treated by a doctor, is just sort of taking this drug on their own like our kids do in some cases. How is an adolescent substance abuser different from an adult? Well, adolescents use for different reasons. They use to experiment. They use a lot of times because they have peers that are using and they're curious. They use because of culture. The culture right now among our kids is very pro alcohol and drugs. It's interesting to me because there were always kids that used drugs. You know it and I know it. When I was growing up, there was those kids that used drugs. But it was different then. There was like that group over there. They were sort of to themselves. You kind of knew who they were. They sort of stuck to their own. Today it's different. Today all the kids Whether they use or not, they hang out together, and it's accepted among even the kids who don't use for their friends to drink and use. And you'll have kids who won't do it, but they'll hang out with the ones who do. It's very accepted in the culture of our teenagers today. Marijuana is something that is extremely accepted. Alcohol as well. They also use for more internal reasons. They tend to use multiple substances as well, so they try a lot of different things. But they end up using for internal reasons. Adults use for external reasons. I had a bad day at work, I'm stressed, I need to relax, I have a drink when I come home. Kids use more because of how they feel inside. I feel inadequate, I'm insecure, I can't talk to girls when I'm at a party, I don't like the way I look, I don't socialize well. Whatever the feeling is, that tends to be a lot of times the reason that they experiment with alcohol and drugs. I had a kid not long ago, a young man that had suffered from anxiety a lot of his childhood, and now he was a senior in high school, still suffering with a lot of anxiety. And his drinking problem started because he said, you know, when I go to parties, Ray, I'm terrified to talk to girls. I can't talk to a girl unless I drink. And that's how it started for him. And the alcohol would loosen him up. And then after a while, he found he couldn't go to the party unless he drank. And then eventually he started drinking even in situations that weren't, you know, producing anxiety for him. And it just escalated from there. So they tend to use more because of how they feel inside. They have more family difficulties. They also have poor impulse control. You know, they're more likely than an adult to have a suicide attempt. That's pretty scary. We hear a lot about kids that suffer from depression or kids that are bullied, you know, that end up attempting suicide or committing suicide. Alcohol and drugs is often involved in that. So some of the consequences, this is why they end up with me usually. They get arrested, or they fail out of school, or they get in trouble with their family, or, you know, some other, you know, usually their relationships are affected first. I have a lot of parents that'll come to me because they'll notice schoolwork starting to suffer. They're not performing as well. I've had kids go away from schools like Belen, good schools, end up in great colleges. And then once they get to college, they're not ready for that transition. They end up partying too much, they end up drinking and using, and they can't manage everything, and they end up failing out and coming back home and closing doors for themselves. And I see it more and more. Kids that had great opportunities, and because of alcohol and drugs, they couldn't kind of seize those opportunities. The alcohol and drugs got in the way of them being able to be successful. And it happens more often than you'd think. Injuries, you know, car crashes. These are the things that, I mean, I don't ever really see anything good come out of teenagers using alcohol and drugs. It just, you know, it's just nothing good comes out of it. I think we have to get away from the idea that somehow this is a normal part of adolescence, because it's not. Experimenting is a normal part of adolescence, and some of that may involve alcohol and drugs. But the license to use it, the thinking that somehow it's okay, and I can go out there, and even my parents in some cases will accept me doing it, that's where I think we go wrong a lot of the times. Some of the signs and symptoms. So these are the things you might see if your child was experimenting. You might see him isolating more. You might see less caring and involvement at home. You might see more defiance. You might see more secretive behavior. He might start lying to you more than usual. He might start having a change in his friends. There's all kinds of things that can be clues. I don't care attitude, maybe unexplained mood swings. Some of you are looking at this and going, what are you talking about? That's my kid, right? Yeah, that's my kid. Yeah, no, I get it. And some of this is actually normal teenage behavior too. But if you see a constellation of these symptoms, I'm not talking just one or two of them, then there might be a problem. And here's what I would say to parents. You know your child better than anyone. A lot of parents I meet with who now have a problem on their hands will say to me, Ray, something told me there was, he was up to something. I knew something was wrong, and I dismissed it. I didn't listen to that little voice inside that was telling me, we may have a problem. Listen to that voice, because you are the ones who are in the best position to detect a problem. And sometimes you know before anybody else does. Usually you know before anybody else does. School attendance problems, drop in grades, entitlement, lying, isolating, tantrums over seemingly minor issues. All of these things can mean your child may be experimenting with alcohol and drugs. And it's important to know. It's important to know. It's funny because, again, remember, drugs have always been around, but when I was in school, kids that experimented, they kept it very secret. They were very secretive about it. I'm going to tell you that today's kids, they're almost entitled about it. They walk around with this idea that it's their right to drink and to smoke marijuana. I have kids tell me, what are you talking? What do you know? And unfortunately, some of the parents fall into that entitlement too and accept it. And I'm here to tell you that with my daughter, again, I'm under no illusions that she got some things by me. I know she did. But I'll tell you, I didn't make it easy. I never made it easy. And I never let her believe that somehow I was okay with it or somehow I condoned it. She always knew where we stood. And I think that's important. So what do? We've got this epidemic on our hands. We've got a lot of kids doing a lot of things they shouldn't be. How do we handle it as a parent? I'm going to tell you that study after study, all the research shows that the number one reason kids don't use drugs, the number one reason, what do you think it is? You. If they know where you stand, and they know they will disappoint you, and they know they're breaking your rules, if you're clear, that's usually the reason that they will make the right decision. Honestly, it's when kids get the mixed messages, when they're not sure where you stand, where in some cases you may have kind of condoned it without realizing it, those are the kids that are going to run with it and are going to drink and use and get out of control with it. And listen, folks, there's exceptions to every rule. I've seen parents that, in my opinion, did everything perfectly and the kids still did it. So, but what I'm saying is there are some things that we can do to encourage our children to make good decisions. Educate yourself like you're doing right now. Learn as much as you can about what's out there, what our kids are facing, what trends there are, what drugs are being used. Learn. Don't be one of those parents that thinks, oh, this won't happen to me. Because I promise you, the minute you think it won't happen to you, that's when you'll be faced with it. Educate yourself. Talk with your kids before they get to the age of experimentation. How many of you in here, honestly, at 8th grade have had this talk already? Good. If you haven't, it's important to do it. It's important to have it way before, like in, I'd say, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade. That's where you want to start having the conversation. Number one, so that you can be educating them, but you can also be educating yourself about where they are. Also, so you can make them feel safe about the idea that we can talk about it. Because if you have that open communication, you're much more likely to know when the attitude starts to shift. And sometimes it does. Again, you are the number one influence in their lives and the reason they will make better decisions. Know your child's friends and know their parents. I got to tell you that my daughter had a core group of girls growing up all through their entire school career. They went the whole way together. When they got to college, they all went separate ways. But, you know, and I knew the parents. And it's funny because when we got to about 16, I think, is where I started to notice that, you know, I thought I knew these people. And it turned out that when it came to alcohol, and even drugs in some cases, I realized that, you know, I didn't quite share the same values with some of those parents that I thought I knew. In fact, I'll tell you, and this is not something I always share, but I think it's important. When my daughter went to one of her friends' 17th, it was either 16 or 17, it might have been 16. The mother held a big party for her daughter for her 16th birthday. And guess what Mom did at the party? Started serving all the girls shots. Let them all have shots of liquor. Well, you can imagine that didn't go over very well with the addiction expert, right? Didn't go over very well at all. We had a conversation that next day. And we never let our daughter go to a party there again because I couldn't trust that she'd be taken care of there. So you learn some things, right? You know, I'll tell you, it's interesting too, and maybe some of you have experienced this, but kids experience peer pressure, but so do parents. You know, I was told by some of the other parents after I made a big stink about it. And you know, some of the parents told me I was overreacting and almost pressuring me at that time to just loosen up a little bit. Well, you can raise your child the way you want to, but I'm going to raise mine the way I want to. And so we can feel pressure too. Set clear limits about alcohol and drug use. It's okay to say no. In fact, we should say no. There's a lot of things about parenting, folks, that I know are not black and white, they're gray. I know this. I mean, you know, it's common sense. But I'm going to say that with this particular issue, when it comes to alcohol and drugs, I think it is and should be black and white. Knowing that they may do it anyway. Knowing that you're not always going to be there and they may not always make the decisions, but I think we should always send the message that it's not okay and we're not going to excuse it or tolerate it. Because I think they need to know where we stand. Because it's those kids that get mixed messages that get into the most trouble. Have consequences for violations and enforce those consequences. I run into a lot of parents nowadays that are afraid to be parents. They're afraid of their kids. They're afraid to have their kids be mad at them. I have news for you, right? If your kid's not mad at you every once in a while, you're doing something wrong. Don't you think? Mine gets mad at me all the time. But I'm not here to be your friend. I'm your parent. And I'm going to be a role model too. So that means I'm going to show you what a hell. I actually don't drink. But I think it's important, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't drink. I'm saying that you should role model what a healthy relationship, what a casual relationship with alcohol looks like. I think that's important for them to see, that you can have when you're an adult, when you're of age, when you've reached a certain point, you can have a casual relationship with it. Now, I choose not to. But my wife every once in a while will have a glass of wine or something. But, you know, our daughters have never seen us drunk. They've never seen us lose control. I won't allow that. I won't do that. And then I would say that if you discover a problem, confront it. Don't wait. And here's the other thing that I see parents get into. They end up in my office and I say, well, when did you first discover that he or she was smoking or drinking or whatever? Well, you know, it's been a couple of years. And we just thought that it would kind of run its course. It doesn't always run its course. In fact, sometimes it progresses and gets worse. So what I would say is, the first time you discover it, you want to intervene at that moment. You want to do something. That doesn't mean your child at 16 years old needs to go to rehab. It means that you have to address it in whatever appropriate way for that situation is. And if you need, someone to guide you or help you, there's counselors, there's people here in the school, but you have to take a stand and confront it. I just threw this in for laughs, but it's a serious problem. I don't mean to scare you. My purpose tonight is not to scare you, but it is for us all to understand the reality and to know, here's the good news. Because all the kids that land in my office, the first thing they say to me is, Ray, Mr. Estefania, everybody does it. That's what they always say. It's not true. Everybody doesn't do it. Not all kids are doing these things. Not all kids are drinking and smoking marijuana. There are kids that are making good decisions. There are kids that are studying and playing sports and doing what kids should be doing. There's lots of those kids. I hope those are your kids and continue to be your kids. And all I'm here to tell you tonight is, don't be blind to the fact that this is what's out there, and this is what our kids are being exposed to on a daily basis. Whether we like it or not, they're getting it on TV, they're getting it at school, they're getting it from their friends, they're getting it on social media, they're getting it in music. It's constantly being bombarded. They're being bombarded with the message that it's okay. Smoke weed, it's fine. Drink, it's not a big deal. Experiment with designer drugs and things that, can kill you. It happens to someone else. It's not true. It's happening to someone's kids. So we've got about 10 minutes. I want to open it up for questions. I think Mr. De Quesada is going to speak to you as well about more school policy kinds of things. But are there questions around this? Is there anything that you'd like to know more about? Any comments that you'd like to make? Yes. Of how to make it hard? Well, listen, there's I just think that we need to have our eyes open. We need to be aware. Here's a common sort of sense thing. And you may not be here yet, but as your son gets older, and maybe you have older kids, they're going to go out late at night, right? They all want to go out till 3 in the morning. I don't know about you, but nothing good's happening at 3 in the morning. But anyway, how many of you, if your child goes out or plans to later on, plan to be up when he or she gets home? I think we should all be up. Why? Because you know what? I want to see you when you walk in. I want to smell you. I want to give you a big hug, and I want to tell me what you've been doing tonight. Right? I mean, common sense. How can you be asleep at the other end of the house when they get home? How are you going to know? So there's just obvious sort of common sense things. I hear parents, well, I was sleeping. I didn't. What do you mean you were sleeping? Right? Have your eyes open. There's you don't have to, it doesn't always have to be financial. It could, there's all kinds of consequences you can put in place. And remember, consequences are different from punishment. But you can make it very clear. Look, here's another one, common sense, right? If you go out drinking and you're 16 and you have a driver's license, and even if you weren't driving when you drank, I don't know you're not going to drive the next. So if you go out and drink, guess what the first thing that's going is? The car. I'm not going to risk you going out and possibly drinking and killing somebody, killing yourself. You've already shown me that you are not responsible and can't be trusted with a 4,000-pound vehicle. Right? I didn't even get my daughter a car till she was 18 years old. To me, I'm sorry, this is my opinion, I don't think the 16-year-old brain is ready for a car. I just don't think so. We waited until she was 18. Now maybe my daughter was less mature than someone else's, that's possible, but our daughter wasn't ready till she was 18. Yes. That's right. That's right. You do not. That's correct. Any alcohol in an underage person, you know, it could be. I think it could be .01 even. Any alcohol could result in them losing their license. Other questions, comments? Yes, in the back. I can, not a problem. I can certainly share the presentation. Actually, I think I already did, right? I think they have it already, so. Yeah, absolutely. Folks, I'm going to tell you, right, those, when they go to the parties, you know, the red cups, they're not filled with Kool-Aid. There was this one kid, my daughter, she had Facebook, so Facebook was, but she had Facebook, she could only have it if my wife could sign, you know, be a friend. We always monitored the Facebook. So we'd see the pictures of the parties. There was always this one kid. She was friends with him almost throughout her whole high school. Any picture that the kids took on Facebook where they all had red cups, this one kid, every picture, I swear, his hand always like this. Never would show the red cup. He always had it behind his back. So other questions, other comments? Yes, please. Thank you. The school does things for the kids. Belen's been great because Belen's one of the few schools that I know that's really been committed to this, like you having to be here tonight, right? I mean, that's just how committed they are to it. They do bring, and I have come before. I don't know that we have plans for me to come right now, but I'm sure, and they can speak to that, that they've probably either already had someone come or they're going to, but they're pretty good about having people come speak on this topic. And sometimes it's been me, and sometimes I'm just here for the parents. Yeah. Sure. Agreed. And trust me when I say that to them, I sound like a broken record too. So I always, listen, it's important to educate the kids, it really is, but I almost think it's more important for me to educate you than it is the kids, because kids hear what they want to hear, right? And what they don't want to hear, they discard. But we still do it, and I think it's important to do it. But I really feel strongly about educating parents, because you're in the position to actually do something about it, right? And whether they understand it or not. Anybody else? Yes, in the back? How about bath salts? You know, I didn't really even bring it up tonight because in this kind of population, if you will, I'm not seeing it really, okay, with sort of these kids. And I deal with a lot of your Belen, your Columbus, your Lourdes kids, right, Gulliver. I'm seeing bath salts in other kinds of older kids, some college kids, maybe people that are more in the club scene. I don't think it's really what you need to be worried about. I think there's other things you should worry more about, like what we talked about today. Yes, other questions, comments? How do I feel about drug testing? Listen, I think drug testing is a very powerful tool. I think it's underutilized. I think it can definitely I drug test people I treat just to know if what I'm doing is being effective. Kids, listen, I think if you suspect something, you should get the information, and drug testing could be one way. I'm not saying go home tonight and you should all drug test your kids. That's not, don't pass by Walgreens now on the way home and, here, look what I got. Don't do that. But if you suspect something and you've got some evidence around it, or that little, voice, that little gut instinct that you have is telling you something's wrong, then I wouldn't hesitate to drug test. I like that schools are drug testing. I think it's a deterrent, and I think it allows us to intervene early on kids before it becomes a problem. So I actually am a proponent of drug testing. But not on everybody. I don't think that, if a kid's doing well and there's no suspicion or no evidence of a problem, that doesn't mean you should drug test them. Yes, other questions? Anyone? No? Okay, well, thank you for being here tonight. I appreciate that. I'll stay around for a little bit if maybe someone wants to come up and ask a question, maybe something more personal, if I can be helpful. I hope this was helpful to you. Know that we're here as a resource. If you ever need us, we can help. I'm trying to get my contact info up there. There we go. If there's ever a question, you're just not sure about something, I'm happy to talk to you on the phone, all I would say is, this is a problem for a lot of kids, and you as a parent, I think, can get through these crucial years and not have to deal with it. But just remember that it's happening to someone's kids, and we don't want to be blind to the possibility that there's a lot of pressure out there. And our kids are getting a lot of messages that go against our values, right, as families, as parents. And we have to, remember, we have to make it difficult for them. You can't be with them 24/7, but there are things that we can do to encourage good behavior and to discourage bad behavior. And it's just important for us to know what they are out there facing. Because I think it's harder today to grow up than it was when we were growing up. I think there's a lot of other dangerous things, the internet, social media, all these things that we didn't have. For me, it was going out riding my bike and maybe getting in trouble in the neighborhood, right? Today, they can sit in their room and not even leave the house and get into trouble. And it's scary. So thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it. Have a good night.